Hello, good evening. Welcome to our second Milan, the online speaker series organized by Epigraph, the Literary Society of Ashoka University, under the aegis of the Department of English and Creative Writing. I am Srimoy and I am a member of the society. Milan is to meet, to come together, to mingle into one another's ideas. We already had the Indologist David Shulman theorize beauty for us in the last week, which was the first week of Milan. We have an excellent lineup. The noted playwright Abhishek Majumdar will meet us next week on Friday, and South African novelist Zoe Wickham will speak to us the week after. But apart from having speakers from outside the university, Milan also serves to have the English faculty meet the larger campus, especially the students outside the classroom space, to illuminate us about their interests and research. This will be inaugurated today by our very own professor, Mali Skotheim. Professor, please join us on the screen. Professor Mali Skotheim earned her PhD in classical literature and philology from Princeton University, where she wrote her dissertation on Greek dramatic festivals under the Roman Empire. She is teaching two courses, Global Literatures in Antiquity and Classical Performance, this semester. And next semester, she's teaching the Gateway course, Forms of Literature, which all English majors need to take to begin their literary studies. Today, her talk is woven around the fascinating question, can literary fragments be considered spolia? No further ado then, I'm going to hand it over to her so we can get right into the talk.
So thank you very much for this introduction, and also to Epigraph for inviting me to speak today. This question that I'm going to be asking is a bit experimental. It's something that has been kind of floating around in my head over the past few years. And so in a way, what I'm doing today is to bring together a couple of interests that I have and to see how they might kind of talk to one another. It's also going to involve a lot of material culture, perhaps more than you might expect for a literary talk, but that's also true of my work in general. I'm very interested both in material culture and also what material culture says, well, the ways that material culture and literary culture can talk to one another. So I'm going to share my screen. Just take me a moment to get that set up. Okay. Now, so that should be visible. So here is my question. Can literary fragments be considered spolia? So I'll come back to this picture on the right, which is a picture of spolia that I really love, actually. Oops, sorry. Okay. Which is it's a little tomb. It's a tomb and it's a door, which represents the door to the underworld. But then it's built into a medieval wall in Ankara. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. So the first thing to do is kind of to explain what this term means. What is spolia? So in classical Latin, spolia means literally the stripped off hide of an animal, but then it comes to mean the arms or armor that are stripped off of a defeated enemy. So this will be familiar to anyone who has read the Iliad, for example. You see these Homeric heroes taking the arms of their enemies often. And it was done also, in a historical sense. I mean, it was really done as part of the practice of ancient warfare in the Mediterranean world. And so a kind of typical way that you will see this word used in classical Latin is just to mean spoils of war, to mean anything that is taken from the enemy. So famous example is in the relief below that term on the left, which is from the Arch of Titus. And this is depicting the spoils that were brought back to Rome from Jerusalem after the sack of Jerusalem in 79 AD. But then in the 16th century, the meaning of this term changes. So in Rome especially, this term starts to be used of any ancient material building material, architectural fragments, which are being reused in lots of different contexts, actually. So what's going on in this particular context is that you have people like Raphael walking around Rome, which at that time, I mean, the architecture was heavily medieval, encountering these antiquities in medieval spaces and kind of trying to come up with a way of describing what was going on. So this is just one example, which is from a church in Trastevere, which has these lovely row of columns, and you can see all the column capitals are kind of different. So there's a kind of aesthetic of variety there in this medieval church that becomes part of what people mean when they say spolia. So I think in a sense you can view the term spolia as it's used today, which is almost always in reference to this kind of early modern meaning. So, but you can view that term as referring not just to the objects which are being reused, but also as evoking some kind of context, some kind of viewing context of those reused materials. And then we have this word fragment. So fragment, as used very often in literary studies, to mean any sort of little bit. But it's most often used to specifically mean some bit of literature for which something else is missing. So if we have only part, if we have only part of a line, if we have only part of a poem, that is a fragment. And so that kind of goes back to this meaning of fragment in Latin, which is just something that's broken off from something else. So we have, I think, in this term, some kind of sense of loss. Okay, so spolia, although I just mentioned to you that the term spolia, to mean reused architectural fragments, is really an early modern invention, the practice certainly goes back to antiquity. So one of the most famous examples is from Athens. So this is the Acropolis of Athens, and we're looking at the north side of the fortification wall. So the Acropolis is where the temple of Athena is located. So the Parthenon, kind of the most famous monument of Athens. So it's surrounded by a fortification wall. And that fortification wall was built right after the Persian sack of Athens, as we see it today. And we also see some other phases of the wall, but that's not what we're going to talk about. We're just going to talk about the part of the wall that was built after the Persian sack of Athens in 480 BC, right before the Battle of Salamis, for those of you who are here from my drama class and who just read Aeschylus's Persians. So right before that battle, the Persians actually captured the Acropolis. And they destroyed the temple that was on top of it, which was an earlier temple of Athena. And when the Athenians went back to their city, they found this temple destroyed. And instead of burying it over or rebuilding it from the material that they found there, they used that material to build the wall around the Acropolis. And so it's a very, very visible example, because it's meant to remind everyone who comes to Athens, every Athenian, of what had happened in that battle. So it's kind of war memorial to have these reused column drums and the reused frieze. So you can see on the left-hand side, you see those column drums. Those column drums are from the destroyed temple. And then on the right-hand side in the wall, you might be able to see bits of the frieze as well. So, so when the Athenians built this wall, they weren't thinking of what they were doing in the same way that people in 16th century Rome were thinking about spolia. And yet modern scholars would use that same term to describe all of these really diverse phenomena. So we would call this spolia now. So in that sense, that term spolia is kind of anachronistic. But just to point out, this actually is a practice that goes back to antiquity, and also to point out that the reasons for reusing building material can really be quite different and quite significant in different ways. Okay, so I'm just going to take you through another few examples just to kind of get you thinking about the different ways that spolia, you might encounter spolia in the Mediterranean world. So this is a much later example. This is a medieval example. So this is from Ankara, so central Turkey, ancient Asia Minor. So this is a citadel in Ankara, and this part of the wall is built around the 7th century AD. And it's filled with ancient material. It's filled with bits of inscriptions. If you come around this wall to the other side, you see these amazing, there's an altar built into the wall. There are statues of Priapus who've been turned on their sides, built into that wall, bits of buildings, bit of a column. So you get this real sense of just kind of, again, variety and kind of a patchwork using ancient material to create something new. There's just a close-up of that wall. And then the outer walls of this citadel have this wonderful little tomb that I showed in the beginning. But if you look at the wall kind of more broadly on the left, you can see there's actually lots and lots of bits of ancient material of various kinds. So again, you have that sense of kind of patchwork. And another example, this is from Miletus, which is also in Turkey, in the southwest coast of Turkey. So this is a bit of a later example from the Seljuk period, but again, they're just using bits that are lying around. And one thing that I think this kind of points at is that there was actually quite a lot of ancient building material lying around for quite a long time. So on some level, this is a question of convenience. But I think there are other cases where we can see a more kind of meaningful usage of these fragments, and I'll get into that. Let's go on. Another example, it's from a house also in Turkey, a place called Stratonikeia, little village. Bits of columns and things. And here's an example from Ephesus. This is a bit different in the sense that you can see they're reusing ancient material. If you look at the top of that gate, you see these ornate blocks. So while we have a sense of kind of that variety, that aesthetic variety, you also, this is also quite decorative. And so you can see maybe there's a kind of balancing between variety and symmetry and ornamentation. Okay, so now I'm going to just go through what I'm thinking about in reference to fragments. So I work specifically on Greek literature in the Roman imperial period. And this particular period of literary history is full of fragments. Greek authors of the Roman period were obsessed with quotation. It's really is a quotation culture. It was very popular to create miscellanies, to fill those kind of miscellanies with quotations, particularly of older Greek authors, to create a sense of classicism. They're often, not always, but most often quotations from authors who were seen as really foundational to Greek literary heritage. So Homer, very popular to quote from, classical Athenian drama, very popular to quote from, whereas they're not quoting really at all from contemporary literature. So in that case, and this I think is something that I'd like to connect to the practice of spoliation, the quotation culture is creating a kind of relationship between contemporary Greek culture and the past, and is kind of curating a sense of antiquity and a sense of literary heritage. Okay, so a few examples of people who are really kind of associated with this quotation culture. So one is Plutarch. So he was writing the 1st century CE, and the kind of main text that we have from him is the Moralia, and that is just kind of miscellany. And it's filled with various quotations as well. We have Aulus Gellius, another interesting example. He was actually Roman, and he wrote in this very fascinating mix of Greek and Latin. So his text, the Attic Nights, is really fully bilingual. And what this Attic Nights, what this text is a series of conversations. It's presented as a series of conversations that he supposedly had in Athens. And so you get a sense from these conversations that people are just quoting ancient literature left and right. And then we have Athenaeus of Naucratis. So that's in Egypt, actually. So he was writing in Greek as well. And he wrote this text called Sophist at Dinner, which is of the late 2nd, early 3rd century CE. So high Roman imperial period. And that is about a dinner party. And you can kind of see, if you think about what I just told you about Aulus Gellius and about Athenaeus, there is this kind of culture of quotations that specifically happen in conversation. And so that's what both of these texts are about. So, so it's a very elaborate dinner party. It goes on for, I think we have surviving about 16 books or so of this dinner party, and we don't have the whole thing. So actually would have been longer in antiquities. It's a fantastically long dinner party in which the guests discuss pretty much any aspect of ancient Greek life and culture and literature that you can possibly imagine. So they're kind of showing off their fantastic education, very often by quoting ancient authors. And by ancient authors, I mean authors that were ancient from the perspective of Athenaeus. So I'm just going to give you one example from Athenaeus to illustrate how this can work. So there are a lot of ways of visualizing the quotation culture of this time. There's a wonderful resource called the Digital Athenaeus, which is a website where every quotation has been kind of cataloged. And so you can go to this website and you can look up all kinds of funny things. So this is a graph that just shows all of the quotations in Athenaeus. And what you can see right off the bat is that, first of all, there are many, many, many authors being quoted. Secondly, certain authors do dominate. So Homer is in light blue. And so you can see in book 1, there are almost 175 citations or quotations of Homer. So that is kind of creating a sort of a portrait of Greek literary heritage that's really dominated by Homer. Aristotle also very popular. That's in that dark gray. You can go also and pull out one individual author and see how many times that author is quoted throughout the dinner party. So this I just pulled out as an example, Euripides. You can see Euripides quite prominent in this text throughout the whole dinner party. And then you can find kind of funny, obscure references to authors who we don't know anything more about. So this is one author who commented on lentil soup and tragedy, and this has been cataloged on Digital Athenaeus. And so you can see there is one reference to this author. I just thought that was funny. Okay, so when people go through Athenaeus and they pull out these quotations, what has historically been done is to try to categorize the quotations in a way that reconstructs that original context, or rather the original literary output of that particular author. So the one example I'm going to show you today is from this author Chiron. He was a tragedian. He was writing in the 4th century BC. And Athenaeus, most of what we have of Chiron, most of the fragments come from Athenaeus. And so if you look up an edition of fragments of drama, what you'll find is a list of the fragments organized by, they've been numbered so they can be easily corresponded to each play that we know that he wrote. So what I'm going to suggest now is that there's another way of interacting with the fragments of Chiron, which takes into account the context in which they appear in Athenaeus. So if we look at this list, and we look specifically at the areas of Athenaeus's text that these fragments come from, we can see that they actually cluster in just a couple of places. And so one place is this one passage in book 13, which I'll show you now. All right, so now if we go to this passage in book 13 of Athenaeus's dinner party, what we find out is that the dinner guests are discussing musical women at this point, and that's why they introduce these fragments of Chiron. So what we learn immediately about their conversation that happens right before the fragments of Chiron are introduced is that they're not just talking about musical women, they're talking about women who are skilled in making garlands, who are skilled also in preparing perfumes. And this mention of perfume, I'm going to suggest, is actually what primes the reader for all of the fragments of Chiron that follow. So then we have the introduction of Chiron, and the first fragment we get is the longest one that we have. It's actually quite amazing. I won't read out the whole thing, but it's been suggested that this fragment, which is about two women in the moonlight, is actually referencing some 4th century artistic practices of kind of intense contrast of light and darkness. That seems to be a kind of style that was developed in the 4th century. And then we have a very similar effect in this literary fragment. But what interests me, though, is that this fragment also introduces a number of other color terms, and also specifically flowers, which are not only associated with vibrant colors, but also with smell, and specifically with perfume. And we know that particularly in the Roman period, so the time that Athenaeus was writing, much after Chiron, sort of mixed perfumes were very popular. And so you could actually find lists of perfume mixtures that actually involve a lot of these ingredients. And we know that right before this fragment, we have this mention of perfume. So I think that what's going on here is that Athenaeus is using this fragment to create a kind of smellscape. So to create a kind of sense of that perfume, but traced through a literary background. So we have mentioned here calamint, and I just put images of these various plants on the right-hand side. Calamint, violet, crocus, which is what saffron comes from, and was something that the Romans particularly prized. And then we have this reference to wiping a shade that resembled sunlight onto their woven robes. That's a reference to the dyeing of cloth with saffron. And marjoram. So I would say that whatever Chiron may have intended, that what Athenaeus is doing is using this to kind of suggest perfume. But then that actually extends, I would say, to the rest of the fragments as well. So it's not just that there's a perfume within this fragment, but actually that when he goes through Chiron and selects which fragments to quote, he's also thinking about this kind of perfuming mix. So he claims that Chiron was fascinated by flowers. This is something that's often repeated by scholars as fact. I just want to point out, we don't actually know whether all of Chiron's plays were full of flowers, because the only fragments that we really have come from Athenaeus, and he's specifically selecting fragments which have to do with flowers. So we don't know, maybe he really was. So anyway, so we have a bunch of fragments about flowers in springtime, and then he's pulling yet more fragments from Chiron, and here we have ivy, roses, again, very strongly associated with perfume, particularly in the Roman period, and lilies. And then the last one is this lovely quote, "You could see a great deal of cypress's fruit turning dark on the tendril tips of time." That refers to probably a quince, which was associated with Aphrodite. So kind of a quince rotting on the vine. So it's kind of interesting contrast to all these other vibrant floral motifs we have in the fragments before. All right. So that was just one very brief example of how Athenaeus uses fragments. One could actually go through Athenaeus's fragments and do a similar exercise, I think, for any of them, and try and understand, why is he using these fragments here? What kind of effect do those fragments have? What kind of aesthetic effect do they have? Or sensory effect do they have at this dinner party? So just to kind of stimulate the conversation, though, about literary fragments, I'm going to take you back to Spolia now, and I'm just going to show you some of the different ways that we find Spolia being used in a very intentional way in various contexts. And I should say, by the way, again, just like this fragment that I showed from Athenaeus, the example itself is somewhat random. And what I'm really suggesting is that you could do this sort of exercise for any number of Spolia contexts, just as you could do it for any number of literary fragment contexts in the Roman period. Okay, so this is an example from Ephesus. I'm going to go through these examples fairly quickly. So this is a church. It was built in the early 5th century CE, and heavily reliant on building material that they took from the ancient city of Ephesus, where it's located. So what interests me, though, is that the pavement of the church is a mixture of blank stones and also stones with text, which were taken from a nearby necropolis. So here are a couple examples. So these are a couple of Latin epitaphs, so Latin tombstones. Here's another example. This is the first part of the tombstone was in Latin, and then it went into a Greek text. It was bilingual text. And what they've done in this case is left the Latin and erased the Greek. And also in the Greek text, erased all of these references to the activities of the deceased kind of participating in the civic life of Ephesus. He was kind of a notable benefactor. Now, amazingly, people who study epigraphy can actually read this, although it was erased. So there are various fragments of it, but the whole inscription has been reconstructed. And you can see that in this floor, you also have this kind of patchwork effect. So there's a reuse of ancient material to create both a statement, I would say in this case, about antiquity, which in this case, I would say that there is some sense of dominance over antiquity because of the particular context that these stones were put into and because of the way that they were erased. But it also creates an effective variety. So close-up of that erased inscription. Just one more example. This is also an epitaph funerary inscription. And this one is in Greek. And you can see it's been very carefully erased only in certain areas. And this is the other half of that inscription. So they're taking a whole inscription and creating a fragment. That's one thing that's going on. And then installing them both in the floor. And there are those two fragments you can see. So they're close to one another, but they're turned around. Okay, and this is my last example for today. So I'm getting close to wrapping up here. This is a really interesting example of spolia. It's from a place called Orchomenos, which was an ancient site. It's actually a Mycenaean site, so going back into the 2nd millennium BC. So if you have read the Iliad, the people who go to Troy to fight are the Mycenaeans. So essentially, the historical site of Orchomenos goes back to the period, you can think of it as around the time of the Trojan War, historically. Then that site is continually occupied. The reason that I had gone to Orchomenos is that it happens that later on in the Roman period, they had a very well documented festival at Orchomenos in the theater, and it was a dramatic festival. And so I visited Orchomenos to look at the theater. But what I found fascinating about Orchomenos was everything that was happening around the theater. So there was this church right across the street from the theater, which is just covered in spolia. I mean, it's built of spolia. You can see already in this initial picture at the front of the church, you can see these column drums on the kind of upper right-hand side of the front of the church. These the circles or column drums taken from the site of ancient Orchomenos. And I'll show you a few more examples. We see more column drums. And they also used a lot of material that was lying around the theater. So, so on the right-hand picture, on the lower side of that picture, you have these stones which have these kind of indentations. So these are tripods. They would have been associated with that festival that was happening in the theater. That's a very common kind of honorific sort of that you would set up in association with a festival as dedication. So, so that's interesting. And then we have this amazing building inscription on the church. So it's written in Homeric hexameters. So this is the inscription that was installed when the church was founded. So in the 9th century AD. And it's very classicizing in a lot of ways, but I'll just point out one thing about it, which is the last line. So in the last line it says, ruling over the territory of Orchomenos of ancient fame. Now, that is a fascinating statement to make because at the time that this church was built, Orchomenos was not called Orchomenos anymore. It was called Scripou. That was the Byzantine name of this town. And so by using the ancient name of Orchomenos, the people who built this church and dedicated this church, designed it and so on, are creating a very, very clear relationship between the church and the ancient history of this town. And so what I just want to point out about that is that just as we saw in Athenaeus, and in fact, all of the Greek authors of the Roman period who are using these quotations of ancient literature to create their works, in a very similar way, we find in the 9th century, this church in Orchomenos, an attempt to create a sense of antiquity, to invent a relationship with antiquity, and to kind of cultivate a heritage which is both literary and also material. I think this church really encapsulates that in a very fascinating way. So there's another thing about Orchomenos, which I think is quite interesting, and that's what I want to kind of conclude on, which is that none of this cultivation of antiquity or recreation of antiquity was new in Orchomenos in any period, really. It's a continual process, and you can see that very clearly in the site of Orchomenos. I'm just going to show you. So this is a theater, just to give you a sense of what I went there to see and ended up not spending very much time in. That's the theater. This is right across the street from the church. But right around from the theater, abutting the theater, is this Mycenaean tomb. And so this was built in the 2nd millennium BC. So what's amazing about this tomb, though, is not just that it survives, but that it was continually used in Orchomenos for many, many centuries after the Mycenaeans disappeared, after the Mycenaean civilization disappeared. So in the Roman period, it was actually reused, this tomb was reused as a religious space. And there's this altar set up, which is probably an altar for the imperial cult. So you have this kind of invention of the imperial cult as in some sort of relationship with the ancient past of Orchomenos. I just have to show you, this is not particularly related to Spolia in any way, but it's just, I just can't take you to Orchomenos without showing you this. This is the ceiling of the side chamber of that Mycenaean tomb. So again, this all would have been open in the Roman period. So, so say that one thing that I find very fascinating about kind of thinking about reuse of spaces, thinking about reuse of fragments, whether they're literary or material, is that that these ancient things, there was never a time in which that kind of reuse was not going on. And yet there are certain periods of time, as I've kind of mentioned throughout this, this talk, there are certain periods of time in which there's a particular reason to cultivate particularly strongly a sense of reuse of the past. So that's what's going on in the church at Skripou. It's what's going on in Athenaeus for different reasons. So when I say, can literary fragments be considered spolia, what I'm really trying to get at is that by looking at spolia, we could perhaps start to think more seriously about the importance of the context in which fragments appear, to think about the aesthetic that creates, which is similarly an aesthetic of variety. It's also an aesthetic which kind of introduces a wide range of voices and perspectives into a text in the same way that you might find looking at a wall which has bits of columns and bits of funerary material and inscriptions. These are all in different styles. They might, be in different voices. And so within that one wall, you actually have this kind of tapestry of styles and perspectives and so on. And I think that is very true of texts which are composed of fragments, as Athenaeus's Sophist at Dinner is, and as many other texts of the imperial period are. Okay, last thoughts about spolia and literary fragments. So okay. So lastly, what I did want to also just point out is that when we talk about, when we refer to, let's say, the church at Skripou as being a church built of spolia, I just want to stress, again, that is a completely anachronistic term, that the people who built that church would not have recognized that term, and they may not have recognized what they were doing was what we might encounter it as. And I think that one big reason for that is that we tend to approach antiquity from our perspective now. We tend to approach these fragments, whether we're thinking about literature or thinking about material culture, approach these fragments from a perspective of scarcity. So there is a great sense of loss. What has been lost? What texts have been lost? What buildings have been lost? What can we not see? It's not clear that that is the context in which Athenaeus was writing, or the context in which the builders of the church at Skripou, for example, were working. So I would say that they were actually working in a context of abundance. There was quite a lot of material around. When Athenaeus selected these fragments, he didn't know that they were fragments. He didn't know that they would become fragments. He probably had access to a lot of the dramas of Chiron, and they may have been complete when he had access to them. So, and similarly, as they're building the church at Skripou, there was just quite a lot of building material lying around from antiquity. So we don't necessarily need to think about these processes as destructive, in other words. And yet, I think that it's also a big part of how we might interact both with literary fragments and also with Spolia now, a big part of our experience might actually have to do with this kind of pervasive sense of loss. So, okay. So I'm gonna stop there. I've just put up a few interesting publications on Spolia. If I've gotten you interested in Spolia and you want to read more, there's been a lot written about this in the past few years, especially people are getting interested in it. Actually, at the same time as people are really getting interested in contexts of transmission and quotation and so on. So I think there's, in ancient studies across a number of different subfields, a kind of greater or growing appreciation of these contexts in which you might find fragments, which is kind of what I'm arguing for as well. Okay, so now let me just stop this screen sharing. Let's see. And now, okay. So I think we're going into questions at this point. If we don't have any questions, yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah. I'll just ask. So one of the questions that came up was, how could we contrast the conceptualization of literary spolia with epigraphs and citations? We could also ask, why should we consider literary fragments as spolia and not epigraphs or citations?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's an interesting question. How would you distinguish, well, one part of it is how would you distinguish citation from spolia? I mean, I would say that actually a lot of the context which we talk about as spolia now. So for instance, I showed you those few pictures of the Church of Mary at Ephesus. That is an example where I would say that you can think of it either as spolia in the sense that these objects are being transported from somewhere else. And in fact, in that context, that there is something violent about it. So even to think about that kind of earlier meaning of Latin as having, in Latin, spolia as having something to do with kind of violent process. In that particular case, that might be applicable. But you can also, I would say, view them as citations. So as material citations. And then as to this question of why think about, like in Athenaeus, why think about literary fragments as spolia instead of citation? I mean, I don't necessarily think of that as being an either or. Yeah, I don't think of them as being mutually exclusive. So clearly in Athenaeus, these fragments are citations. But the question is, that I'm trying to get at anyway, is whether, especially as modern readers, whether we interact with these fragments in a way that is similar to the way that we might interact with spolia in material contexts. So when we come at them now, if we're coming at them as fragments and not as citations of works that we can actually read. So in that sense, you could say there's a distinction to be drawn between fragments in Athenaeus of works like Homer, where we do have the text now. We can read that text. We can see, is Athenaeus changing something about this text when he quotes it? Where exactly does it come from? What's around it in that, that wider literary source? There's a distinction drawn between that and someone like Chiron, where we just don't have any evidence of where these quotations come from, because the only fragments that we have are from Athenaeus. Yeah, thank you.
The next question we have is, It's something that Professor Verini asked. She's interested in how the concept of spolia as a way of understanding literary fragments compares to intertextuality and bricolage, Levi-Strauss's notion of repurposing pieces of a cultural heritage that has been ruined. So she asks, does spolia necessarily connote conquest, or can it be a reuse of the past in some manner?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I would say that and again, this gets back to the way that spolia is actually used to describe a very, very wide range of phenomena. So I don't think that it's the case that in every material context, what we call spolia is an act of conquest. I think that there are specific examples where you can say that that's true. And I think that the Church of Mary is one of them. But in Ephesus is one of them. I've argued that about that space. But if we think about something like the walls of Ankara, I showed a few pictures of those walls, and there's a lot of ancient material built into those walls. It's not clear to me that that is an act of conquest. In many cases, the fragments that are built into those walls seem quite decorative or even playful. And so I would say that could be, maybe a better comparison in a way to what's going on in Athenaeus, where he's kind of using fragments to create a kind of fabric or create different effects, which does not necessarily involve conquest or a supremacy of, in that context, it would be Greek literature of the imperial period over the literature of the past. So then, it's very interesting, these other ways of thinking about fragments that you've brought up. So lots of different ways of thinking about kind of collage and patchworks. And I think what I would say about that is that really, I don't think that it's actually possible to say that all literary fragments fall into one category or the other. So one thing that and actually I think this is something that comes for me like partially out of spolia studies. The one thing that's happening in spolia studies right now is that rather than attempt to characterize spolia in general, there is a greater attempt to look at individual contexts of spolia. So to look only at one space and to say, what is going on in this one space? How is spolia being used in this one very particular moment? And I think that's where I think that is where I see the most interesting work done with fragments, literary fragments as well, when there's a real kind of sensitivity to a specific context. So as you're saying, in some cases that might involve a kind of sense of conquest or superiority or priority, but in other cases not. And that's kind of, I think that's what's so kind of exciting about both of these phenomena, that they are so diverse and kind of uncharacterizable, right? So it's a funny thing, I have to say, it's a funny thing about spolia studies, that the books that I showed, that they don't reach any consensus about what spolia actually is. It's really difficult to universalize about.
The next question we have actually follows from your answer to the previous question. It's from Professor Chaturvedi. She asks about whether literary spolia mostly used to show off the education of the people using them in the writings, or to provide a link to the past, where the past was viewed, thinking that the past is viewed in a positive light. Mm-hmm. You've shown that this wasn't always the case with architectural spolia. The question then is about literary spolia. If one can generalize it at all, are there any important differences in the kinds of use that literary spolia are put to in the periods you're interested in, and when compared to other kinds of spolia?
Yeah. So absolutely, yeah. So literary fragments and this kind of quotation culture that I'm talking about in the Roman period, and particularly in Greek authors of the Roman period, it's definitely cultivating a very particular relationship with the past that has to do with the political context in which these works are being written. So specifically, at a period of time when Greece was under the political control of Rome, and there was a lot of anxiety at that time about what that meant for Greek culture. So, so in other words, whether the proudest moments of the Greek past were already in the past. So this is a question that a lot of Greek authors in the Roman period were struggling with. And so one way that they approached that question is to create an ever stronger sense of what it meant to be Greek. A lot of Greek identity was really invented in the Roman period. It's been said that the Greeks were never more Greek than than in the Roman period. So it's an incredibly kind of self-conscious way of writing, I think, and then I think it's interesting in that context, even in this kind of moment of real anxiety and literary anxiety, that the quotations are so overwhelmingly of ancient authors. They simply refuse to quote contemporary Greek literature. And so this is something that I find actually very irritating, because I study Greek drama in the Roman period, and we don't have any quotations of Greek drama in the Roman period, because the only dramatists that they'll quote are, the dramatists of the 5th century and 4th century, and to a lesser extent the Hellenistic period. So I guess I'm just trying to get at this kind of connection between ethnic identity and the creation of an ethnic identity that's based on a relationship with the past, and where there's somehow this persistent question of whether Greek ethnicity can be located in the present or always in the past. I think that's one thing that's behind this kind of quotation culture. So I'm not sure if that gets at the question that you're asking, but this is, yeah, it's kind of what came to mind.
Thank you for your answer, Professor. It is also very interesting that the people who use these repurposed materials generally leave them unchanged when it was fulfilling some purpose of history. The question then is, when they do modify them, they seem to have done so by erasing the Greek text, leaving the Latin behind, or just completely destroying the text. What could have been the motivation behind these erasures? Was it something about the message that could have been offensive? Was it a way of asserting linguistic dominance?
Yeah, that's fascinating. That's fascinating that you noticed that. This is actually something that I didn't notice until, so I was looking at the deletions in the inscriptions from that church, and someone else pointed out to me that the Latin text, that none of the Latin was erased. So whereas in the Greek text, the erasures seem to be very intentional and very specific. So for example, the erasure of all of the benefactions of this one individual, who's a very kind of prominent individual in Ephesus. He donated money for various building projects, also for festivals. The erasure of those benefactions, I view that as an attempt to show that these kinds of civic benefactions, which are often associated with pagan cult as well, are not the kind of benefactions that that the church wants people to be engaged in, essentially. That is not what will get you eternal fame, as one might have thought in, say, the 2nd century AD in Ephesus. So another way you can see that is, there's another one I didn't show, but it's an inscription which has 3 crowns, and these crowns would be given also to benefactors to kind of show appreciation of the community for what they had done in the Roman period. And so that inscription with the images of 3 crowns that is erased. The crowns are erased, but in such a way that it's very clear what was there. So it's erasure that shows, in a way, like draws greater attention to what has been erased. So then as to the question of why Latin text wouldn't be erased, I think that probably has to do with Greek just being the more prevalent language in Ephesus at that time. So perhaps there's a sense that you don't really need to erase Latin because not that many people are reading Latin who are attending this church in the 5th century. And that's the most likely explanation. But it's very interesting, and it is very striking across that pavement.
The next question is something that Professor Yusuf asks. Do you think Spolia are meant to help create an index for visitors of how to encounter a site, or do you think some other form of mediation is necessary to understand the site, such as a guidebook of some sort of a Cicerone?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question to answer. So let me just take one example. So let me just go back to the church at Orkamnos. So it seems like one question that this is getting at is, would people who encountered that church, how much would they have understood of where this material was coming from and what it was alluding to? So even if the people who were involved in designing the church and deciding where that building material was going to come from, even if you could say perhaps they did have a sense of intentionality about it. But does that mean that they expected everyone who encountered the church to understand? So one thing I would say about that is that, I mean, first of all, obviously, of course, we don't know that that's the case, right? One thing I'll say about that, though, is that there's quite a lot of material still lying around this area. So it doesn't seem particularly unlikely to me that a visitor could make the connection between a tripod base that's built into the church wall and a tripod base that's lying across the way, which seems to be kind of piled up alongside a lot of other ancient material. I mean, one might make the connection between this being something that seems to come from old Orchomenos, even if you don't necessarily know exactly what it is or exactly what the connection would have been to the cult. And then another complicating factor is that inside this church, I didn't mention this before, but it's a really interesting thing that so I mentioned that the reason I went to Orchomenos is that I wanted to see this place where all these amazing inscriptions about the festival had come from. Well, those inscriptions are built into the church walls. The reason that they're actually preserved so well is that they were reused as building material. But they're built into the church walls in such a way that they're not visible to visitors. So that's kind of a complicating factor. On some level, there's this reuse of material that's referencing this old traditions, but then on the other hand, it's not always being presented as something that you need to make sense of, or you are supposed to be making sense of as you're in that space. So yeah, I guess my answer to your question is kind of annoying, which is that it's complicated. And I think you would honestly have to look at it site by site. Yeah, but it would be a very interesting thing to think about, for sure. And I think especially in relation to what other material might be lying around or might be visible in other contexts at a particular site.
I had a lot of very interesting questions, but due to the lack of time, we'll just take one more. The question is, would literary works written in English, like post-colonial India, also count as spolia? Even in works where there is no quotation as such of English authors, doesn't the language itself become a kind of spolia? Or the fact that the tradition of the novel was borrowed from the West?
That's really a fascinating question. And if I could just actually draw one parallel with Greek literature of the Roman period, because I do think that there's a parallel to be drawn, it would be that in that case, what you're pointing out about language itself being potentially a form of spolia, I do think that you could view the language of Imperial Greek prose, particularly, as having some of that dynamic. So this language, this literary language that was developed in the Roman period, was highly classicizing. So it's another way, and I mean, they're quoting ancient authors, but they're also using vocabulary that is both hearkening back to an ancient Greek past, particularly a classical Greek past, and kind of pursuing all kinds of grammar books and things in order to recover this vocabulary. They wanted to speak like the classical Athenians, essentially, and that there's also a place element to that. So it's very much centered on Athens. So this kind of obsession with Athens that continues in scholarship on the Greek world today is something that we see also developing in the Roman period, and also centering around language, because actually there were many dialects of Greek. So the particular literary dialect in the Roman period is highly, we could say, Atticizing. So I think it'll be very, very interesting to explore that in the way that you're suggesting in relation to English literature in India. It's not something that I'd considered, but I think it's a fascinating idea.
Thank you very much, Professor. This was a very fascinating talk, and many thanks to the audience who showed up and turned in and asked interesting questions. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you again next week.
Thank you.